It looks like we're live. And welcome, everybody. This is the All Aboard podcast. Your buddy, Phil Bell. It is a pleasure to be with you here. We're trying something new. We've never been live on YouTube, so if we have a little bit in the way of hitches, please excuse that. But we are going to do everything we can today to make this exactly what you're expecting.
And it looks like we're live. And welcome, everybody. This is the All Aboard podcast. Your buddy, Phil Bell. It is a pleasure to be with you here. We're trying something new. We've never been live on YouTube.
How that goes. So, the first thing that I want to do is thank all of you. I know it's been a little bit of a crazy few days where we have been doing everything that we possibly can to get a lot of our, selves in order as we have a few transitions here. But this is a great opportunity because now I have the ability to chat with you a little bit in the, during the day. As I have a little bit more free time. So let's talk about rail preservation. The first question is, what is preservation? And so it's from the Latin praeservare, which means to keep. And I studied Latin a little bit in high school and actually was pretty bad at it when it came to college. But in practice, it really just means preserving aspects, or I should say saving aspects of our lives for the future. And that includes the railroad. So preservation and railroading, of course, is one of the more controversial subjects. So actually part of the reason why I had that whole test pattern out there was because I wanted to put on my fire retardant suit, because I know if anything, I am going to get flamed big league for a lot of the things that we talk about right here. Now, it's controversial because it involves the railroads themselves, rail enthusiasts, the legal system, governments at every level and in every possible way, and a variety of other industries that participate, most notably the insurance industry. And that's, of course, because a lot of rail preservation does tend to hinge on operating excursions and people wanting to see steam engines and ride behind them, and vintage passenger cars, vintage freight cars, Thomas the Tank Engine, you name it. So there's always a lot involved. And then one of the toughest aspects of this is because large amounts of money and labor are required for the most prominent aspects of this, and they're almost always hard to come by. So we're always therefore asking the question, what should be reserved? How should it be preserved? And where should it be preserved? So that's what makes this so difficult, and there are a myriad, and I really do mean a myriad of players that tend to get involved in this. So let's talk about the different types of rail preservation. And now the most common form is one of my favorites because it's the most inexpensive and the easiest to get involved in, and that is memorabilia. And so this is a 1964, April 24, 1966, timetable from the New York Central. And it's kind of interesting because you have the 20th Century Limited here, you have an E8 in the lightning stripe scheme, but then you have the cigar band logo up here, so you can tell this was a time of change for the New York Central. That's the easiest, and that is the most common because so many of us are, we're buying, we're selling, you name it, on Etsy, on eBay, of course, on the All Things Trains website. And I want you to go to all three of those places because we're going to have some amazing stuff for you starting this week. But when you buy and save these, you are preserving a key aspect of railroading. And that's because this is one of the ways that the railroads themselves most closely interact with the majority of people. Like it or not, most of us aren't shipping by rail. That's because most of us aren't involved in actually shipping large amounts of goods from point A to point B. But almost everybody has probably said, well, I'm thinking about taking a train. How do I get there? Well, what you would do, whether it's today or years ago, is you'd get a timetable. You'd learn a little bit about the railroad. In this case, New York Central advertising their freight service, Road to the Future. And then you go in and you can find fares, and you can find schedules, and you can find everything. In fact, as you look through, you can also find advertisers, which in this case is mostly the New York Central advertising its freight service, because as you know, that's when the New York Central was going close to bankruptcy, and Al Pearlman and his team were trying to, of course, stop that from happening. But that is a very, very good way that you preserve railroad history, and not just railroad history, but the history of our nation overall, because so much goes into this, like I said, because that's how most people interact with the railroad. Another form of rail preservation, and I'm lucky enough to have more than a few at my fingertips, comes in the form of railfan material. So this is Trains magazine from January 1959. On the back is somebody we'll be talking about soon. That's Patrick McGinnis, who was the president at different points of the original Norfolk Southern, the New Haven, and the Boston and Maine. And, of course, he managed to end up in prison as a result of some of that. And that is what we will be talking about in a future episode here at the All Aboard podcast. But this media is so interesting because not only does it offer information on the railroad itself, but it offers so much about how we as a people live. Think about the writing style. Think about the advertisements. What are you going to see? I know in some of the older magazines, the railroad magazine before the railfan and railroad era, you would see, basically pinup stuff there because it was targeted at, younger men who, of course, we want to see attractive women. In other magazines, you'll see advertisements for model boats and so forth. That was an era when more men, obviously because this is targeted toward men, were interested in different types of hobbies. So the advertisers knew that they could be there. Look at the way that everything is printed. Look at the colors or lack thereof that's included in the magazine. Seeing all of that gives you an insight into how people lived at the time. But more importantly, it also gives you an insight into how railroads were at that time. Because think about it. The railroad does change so much. Now, if you were to go someplace, let's just say Lorton, Virginia, where I like to railfan a lot, you see it looks dramatically different by Gunston Cove Road than it did in the early 1970s when the original auto train was operating. And that's from things that are as mundane as the fact that the street that I pull off of no longer crosses the tracks on a little humpback bridge. The bridge was taken down. Or it can be something as noteworthy to the rail operation as the fact that the siding is no longer a short siding that goes onto the main line, but it's a long one so they can actually work the train back and forth and have room to do all the loading off of the main line. That impacted operations. The terminal has been rebuilt. So when you're going through these railfan magazines and you're buying them, and that also applies to books and so on, you are actually, in a way, preserving the railroad as it was, because of course, since things are going to change, it's going to be very difficult for anybody to understand what that was without this type of preservation. But of course, the most prominent form of preservation comes by saving railroad equipment and structures. And so that's your locomotives, your passenger cars, freight cars, maintenance away equipment, station facilities, shop facilities, and on occasion, even office buildings. And those are the big ticket efforts that are, on one hand, the most recognizable and the most impactful, but that's also where it gets difficult. That's where things tend to go absolutely bonkers. Now, let's start by talking about several examples. And the first we have is one of the good. And the good is the Strasburg Railroad. Now, that was built at one point to connect the Strasburg area to Philadelphia, or at least that was the intent. Now, it never quite got there, but in practice, it ended up connecting the Strasburg, Pennsylvania, to the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line, Philadelphia to Harrisburg at Paradise, Pennsylvania. And the vast majority of the Strasburg Railroad is still in operation. Now, if you go there to visit, it's certainly worth your time. And I know there are a lot of people, if you're a diehard rail enthusiast, you might look over there and say, oh, well, look, that's something that's more kid-focused and it's for families and it's not for rail enthusiasts like us. But the reality is it very much is for rail enthusiasts like us. And so I hope you will take the opportunity to go ahead and visit that. And if you are on CP5 Cam, let's see how well our technology is open and see if we can't, quite possibly, get a photo for you of what it's like over at the Strasburg Railroad. And of course, as I can see, it isn't quite working. That's how it is here at the All Aboard podcast at times. So what we'll do is we'll forego that, but we'll certainly try a little bit as we're continuing to move along here. But what is interesting about the Strasburg is, first of all, of course, it was created way back when the early 1830s. So 1832 to be exact, and therefore it's in the same league as the Baltimore and Ohio from 1827 and the South Carolina Railroad from 1830, something that's very old, very, very noteworthy, and the majority of it, as I said, not only still exists, but the majority of it is still operated. Now, it doesn't go into downtown, but what it does is goes almost there. However, the station is, of course, right across from the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, and that means if you are taking a trip to that area and you want to do some rail fanning, everything that you want to see is very, very close. Strasburg and the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, both right across from each other. The Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania utilizes the Strasburg to get its equipment in and out to the outside world, so when they get something new, it comes right down the Strasburg, they bring it in. There are some photos out there where you can see some Strasburg steam engines or steam engines they were operating, bringing new equipment that was acquired by the Railroad Museum to them, so it's really neat. And if you go back, and I can't remember the issue, unfortunately, but Trains Magazine actually did a piece in the 1970s about the Strasburg taking a locomotive, a GG1 from Penn Central, I believe it was Amtrak by that point, that had a traction motor problem, and doing the replacement at the Strasburg shops, where they actually dragged the locomotive down their line, did the work, and took it back to Amtrak at Paradise, aka Lehman Place. Now, by the 1950s, however, the Strasburg had declined significantly. Now, the passenger service declined because one thing that a lot of railroads experienced, streetcar lines came along and they took a good chunk of the Strasburg's business because they were faster. And then, of course, they didn't have much in the way of freight customers, so that declined too. Now, by the 1950s, the family, and I believe the year was 1958, they said, you know what, we're done. We want to get out of this, or I should say the estate of the last owner, and they put it up for abandonment. So there were a group of rail fans, and they decided, we're going to get together and save this line. And there's a really neat story out there about how they did it. It was very much a struggle, and if you consider purchasing rail property, even though it may seem like an insignificant amount of track or an insignificant line where there's no business on it, then as now, they almost always ask a mint for it, simply because new railroads are very, very hard to come by. And so what the fans who started this had to do is they pretty much sold stock in their new company that was going to operate this. And in order to get people really enthusiastic, all of the stockholders were given the title of vice president. So that's pretty cool. You know, you buy a share of stock or a couple of shares of stock, and I can't remember how much they were selling them for, but basically you could walk around and say, hey, I'm vice president of a railroad. And I think almost all of us would enjoy doing that. But they did it, and they were successful. In 1958, they restarted freight service. In 1959, they started their flagship tourist service, which we now see today. And it is one of the most popular tourist attractions in the area that stretches from New York City through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. And so tapping the New York City market means that it has a lot of success. And year after year after year, you will see families go there and go there and go there, and they will go back. I personally remember going there as a kid, and one of the coolest trips, I should say, that I ever took. The usual route, by the way, the route doesn't change. The equipment might change from time to time, but the route doesn't change. We went right on down to Lehman Place, and what happened? While the engine change was happening, you saw the Broadway Limited just come by like this, and it was truly a magical thing for a kid like me who was already infatuated with trains, but to see a passenger train, an Amtrak train, and at the time, you know, I didn't know all the history and so forth. I wasn't sitting there and saying, man, that should be the Pennsylvania Railroad's train. But to see it running at full speed and it felt like it was going to suck all of us into its wake was just amazing. And I think that moment, more than anything else, really solidified me becoming a highly trained rail enthusiast. So they reportedly carry between 250 and 300,000 passengers per year. And if that number is accurate, at the 300,000 passenger per year mark, that is more than Amtrak Silver Star, Silver Meteor, and Lakeshore Limited combined during fiscal year 24, which for them is a portion of 2023 and a portion of 2024. So that gives you an idea of how much business they do on the Strasburg, and that's just on the tourist side. Now, they also provide freight service, and that, like I said, they've actually been doing that longer than they've been providing the tourist service by 1 year. So starting in 58 with the tourist service, following in 1959. And that is something they take seriously. If you do go there to visit, you'll see that they have a transload facility that is right outside of their shop facility, right next to the parking lot. So it's easy to view without, going any place that might be questionable. I don't think there's a explicit no trespassing sign, but I would treat it as if it is, because, that's just an area where you don't really want to go unless you have some kind of accompaniment or explicit permission. And they have a diesel switcher that they use to provide that service. And on top of all that, they do a lot of contract work, which helps keep other steam locomotives in service. So if you are following a lot of the Railfan boards, and of course over at allthingstrains.com, routinely you'll see somebody talking about some part that's been fabricated for a steam engine here or there. Oftentimes it's actually coming from the Strasburg Railroad itself. So they have three important businesses that they have managed to keep going during this time, and that's what has made them a very strong example of rail preservation. Now, to give you an idea also, they don't have volunteers. So a lot of people will say, hey, I'd love to volunteer, because they've heard from a lot of people that you should volunteer. And so, of course, they amble on down to Strasburg. But all the people who are there, those are employees. And so that gives you an idea of the level to which they are looking to not only operate that railroad, but to keep it a strong, ongoing concern. That's not to say that volunteers are a bad thing. I work with volunteers a lot. I've been a volunteer on a variety of things, including some rail-related, but this does show a commitment to making it an ongoing business, even if they're not doing it necessarily on the for-profit basis that you might see with others such as Andy Muller at the Reading and Northern and the Grand Canyon Railway. But what makes this a good and successful operation? Well, first of all, the fact that they created a structure that would endure. People are going to come and go. And an organization, you've heard this claptrap over and over again, that, hey, it's only as good as its people. Well, that's true. It is only as good as its people. And people are going to come and go. So what does that mean? You have to have a structure where when people go, that somebody else can be plugged in. And if that somebody else doesn't work, then you can plug somebody else in before it takes everything down. And a good example, recently, as I was doing a little bit of research for this program, we saw that the Strasburg had actually, I think it was in 2021 or 2022, they had something like 4 different general managers. So one who had been there for 50 years, his term ended and he retired. The second died after briefly serving. A third was not a good fit. And then a fourth had just been hired. And that is almost direct quote from Kelly Anderson, who had posted that on one of the forums there. And so that gives you the understanding, hey, they made a structure that would work. They made a structure that would endure. And that is one of the things that keeps you from having the problems that you see in other types of preservation, where you might have something good and then some of the people change and the new people come in and they're not as good, or they don't understand how things have worked. And therefore you see things falling apart. And that tends to lead to the ultimate horror, which is seeing things that you might have thought were preserved. Maybe that's your favorite locomotive, maybe that's your favorite station building, or something that was relatively rare, getting then cut up and totally destroyed and never existing again. Now, the strange thing is it never seems to happen when we're talking about art museums, because, when was the last time you heard about a Picasso getting tossed in the dumpster? But that is a reality that we do face when it comes to rail preservation, because the reality is, no matter how much we love trains and no matter how much we are really devoted to it and are willing to contribute our money and our time and so on, the reality is everything related to a railroad is business, industrial equipment that was never, ever intended for the use that we're giving it in the tourist or preservation context. And so that is what really makes the job to be incredibly difficult and why I do have a lot of great respect for the people at Strasbourg, because they've been able to do this and do it over decades. That makes it work. Now, a second example, so the Strasbourg was the good. Now let's move on to the bad. The bad is Paulson Spence. Now, I want to be clear. I think Paulson Spence was actually a very good guy who had really neat ideas. He was clearly a rail enthusiast from birth, just like a lot of us, but I'll tell you why he was bad. Now, a little background. He was an entrepreneur from Louisiana. He ended up getting involved first in the sales of steam pressure valves, and if you've done sales, you know it can be a very lucrative career if you're willing to do the hard work in it. And later on, that sales experience and working with steam pressure valves led to the creation of the Spence Engineering Company, and there he sold steam regulator valves. And some of the information out there indicates that they claim to even have their valves in the White House. Now, it's clear from this that Spence was certainly a fan of steam. And of course, his mother said that I remember him from being a little kid always running down to the tracks. So if that sounds familiar to you, or you want to look in the mirror and say, yeah, that's me, that's a lot of us. So he got involved in the sand and gravel business in his native Louisiana, because that has always been a very lucrative thing. First thing he did is he purchased some land near the Illinois Central in the Tagafanoa, South Tagafanoa, Louisiana area. I tried everything to get that pronunciation correct. I am a highly trained rail enthusiast, but I'm not always a highly trained pronunciation specialist. So please, if you're from Louisiana, forgive me for butchering that. And the first effort, he built an industrial track to one of these gravel pits and moved that by rail. So basically, he had a little industrial spur, and he used a steam engine to work it. And later on, he did the same thing. And I should note that the first engine he purchased for this was a Baldwin-built 060 number 382. Now, from the Illinois Central. Now, you're probably wondering, wait a minute, Phil, did you say an Illinois Central number 382? It was not Casey Jones 382. That was a 460. And this 382 was quite a bit different than the engine of Casey Jones, which I do believe was repaired after his fateful wreck. But later on, he purchased the Gulf and Eastern, which served an even larger gravel pit in Louisiana, and it already had a rail operation on it. And so, of course, this increased the number of steam locomotives that he built. And there is a link to a website called Meridian Speedway in the description after the stream is over. I encourage you to check it out. It's a very, very good explanation of his interest in steam and why he felt that was better than diesel, even though this is the time when you were starting to see the ascendancy of the diesel locomotive and more steam locomotives being retired. And of course, that is what led to his ability to purchase a lot of them, because railroads everywhere were certainly sending them off to retirement. And so there was a true operation. Now, he had an even more ambitious goal, and that was to build the Louisiana Eastern. And that was proposed to be a 120 route mile railroad that would have stretched from Baton Rouge to Pearl River, Louisiana. And at Pearl River, he would connect with the New Orleans and Northeastern, which was a part of the Alabama Great Southern, which itself was a part of the Southern Railway. You, of course, can ride the New Orleans and Northeastern today if you take Amtrak's Crescent between Meridian, Mississippi and New Orleans, Louisiana. Also, that is the northern end is the jumping off point for the Meridian Speedway that we discussed in the last episode with Norfolk Southern and KCS. Meridian, by the way, is a neat place to visit in terms of rail fanning, because you're going to get obviously KCS/CPKC trains there and Norfolk Southern, which certainly makes for plenty of interesting shooting, and don't forget Amtrak twice a day coming through. Well, the Louisiana Eastern never did get that 120 route miles of main and branch line traffic, but he did significantly utilize a number of the steam engines that he purchased, and that also included running some excursions. All of this sounds really cool, right? But there was one small problem. In 1961, at the age of 66, Paulson Spence had a heart attack and he died. Now, he had set aside $400,000 for the purpose of building a museum to hold his steam engines, some of which included nickel plate Hudsons 464s, as well as a couple of Gulf Mobile and Northern, and later Gulf Mobile and Ohio 462 Pacifics. Unfortunately, there was a legal technicality, as the Meridian Speedway site calls it, that led to that portion of the will being overturned. And what happened when it was overturned? Well, the cutting torches came out and almost all of his collection. Some locomotives, of course, of which were the last of their kind out there, were cut up completely. Now, we have put a link to an RYPN, Railway Preservation News Forums article where they talk about the exact steam engines that were there and what ended up surviving. But, quite frankly, it's nothing more than a massacre. And why did the massacre happen? Well, Paulson Spence, being somebody who was truly devoted, who acquired some of the best available steam locomotives that were out there, who had a plan, who had the resources, and so on. And by the way, a family that clearly knew that he was a lover of trains, and this is something that meant a lot to him, but there was no way for this to go on beyond him. And what did that mean? It meant that everything, almost everything, was cut to pieces and now no longer exist. And it's a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't have a structure in order to actually preserve all of this equipment and all that goes along with it, which, by the way, includes parts, it includes manuals, and to a certain extent, it includes knowledge of how to operate this, especially because you're going to have a number of people who are in your sphere if you're able to get as far as Mr. Spence did. And now for the absolute fugly. And the absolute fugly, unfortunately, comes to us from the Indiana Transportation Museum. Now, this was one of the places where I had hoped to visit because as a kid, certainly a young, highly trained rail enthusiast, I would read all kinds of books and try to find out where everything is, and if we happen to take a trip somewhere, I wanted to be able to stop by a train museum, assuming I could convince my parents to do it. Usually they were willing because they knew if they didn't, then I was going to start, being ridiculous, which, I mean, quite frankly, is what always happened. So, the Indiana Transportation Museum in Noblesville, Indiana, and this was just outside of Indianapolis. And in addition to the museum, they also had access to a 38-mile rail line that extended between Noblesville and Tipton, Indiana, that had once belonged to the Nickel Plate Road. And each year, they would operate a state fair train or a set of excursions to the state fair, which were highly patronized, very popular, and this is a big benefit to the museum as well as the preservation community. And the most notable piece of equipment that they had there was nickel plate 282, number 587. And for those of you who were active in the 1980s as rail enthusiasts, I'm sure you had a lot of opportunity to either see the 587 operating in person as part of the Norfolk Southern Steam program, or you saw a lot of pictures, which is what I did as a young man, of the 587 operating as part of the Norfolk Southern Steam program, and it was terrific. In fact, the engine's really interesting because not many people remember this, but it was actually... the Nickel Plate was its second owner, the Lake Erie and Western, a railroad the Nickel Plate took over, and which gets almost no press, and we're going to try to cover it and get you some history on that, because most people tend to forget about it, was actually the company it was built for. But the Indiana Transportation Museum, it exists. Everybody sees it there. It's great. There's no problem, right? Well, then one small thing happened. The Federal Railroad Administration came in and they condemned the trackage that they were operating on, which was owned by, I believe it was the Hoosier Heritage Port Authority, but the ITM, Indiana Transportation Museum, had the responsibility to maintain it because they were operating it. They condemned it because of track defects. Okay, well, I remember reading about this on the internet at the time, and that said, gee, that's a tough break, but I'm sure they'll get the tracks fixed, right? No problem. Every so often you will hear about something where the Federal Railroad Administration will step in and say, hey, we see some unsafe conditions here or there, remedy it, and whoever is responsible will remedy it, and you move on. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Then the city of Noblesville decided, we're going to go and investigate where you have been storing all your equipment, which happened to be city property in a place called Forest Park. And they had this, by that point, for over 40 years, close to 50 years, they had leased that property. And whether it is accurate or not, the mayor and his crew determined, hey, we see all of this hazardous material, we don't like it. The folks from the museum contend that it was no more hazardous than what you would find in a normal auto repair garage. And the reality is, of course, if you're going to deal with trains, you're going to be working with lubricants, diesel fuel, coal, you name it, especially if we're talking about older equipment, and there's going to be a lot, solvents and so forth. You're working with the paint, stripping paint, applying paint, sealings, coatings, and so forth. Everything that you would see that does go into an automobile, except on a larger scale, especially if you end up dealing with something like wood. And of course, we know that some cars are wood-bodied, old cabooses, freight cars, and so on. Anyway, this led to the city saying, we are going to cancel your lease and you have to leave. Now, if somebody cancels your lease, or say where you're living, and you have to leave, well, generally you get a U-Haul. It's a painful process and you go. But when we're talking about a railroad museum that's been in the same place for more than 50 years, and it has a vast number of locomotives, rail cars, and so forth, that's going to be very difficult to pick up and move. And not to mention any kind of smaller artifacts, kind of like the employee timetables that might be on hand. So this dragged on for a couple of years, and ultimately a judge said, you have to go, and you have to go in 30 days. So this led to a very helter-skelter effort to save as much as they could. Some equipment that had been considered preserved because it was part of the museum was cut up and scrapped on site because they didn't have any place they could take it, and they didn't have anybody who wanted it. A really sad story is the first EMD SW1 was being transported, and it was on a flatbed truck, because the other problem here is that by that point they did not have access to the railroad, and the railroad itself was disconnected from the national system, which made getting anything in and out of the museum even more difficult. And oh, by the way, did I mention the judge gave them only 30 days to vacate? Well, this SW1 is on a flatbed truck with a company that is supposedly very skilled in moving dimensional loads, and a locomotive is, of course, going to be a dimensional load when you're going down a highway. And what happened? They smashed into a bridge and destroyed the cab of the locomotive because it was too high to fit under. And there are plenty of pictures out there on the internet, and I'm not going to share them because they're too painful here to see. And private owner had purchased this locomotive. Now they did get it fixed, which is good. They put a new cab on it, but that's a big deal to have that happen. Thankfully, the 587, which was in pieces because it was being restored, was moved to Kentucky Steam Heritage Corporation, the same place where the 2716, the 284 Kanawha, the C&O Kanawha, is out there being restored, and so it was saved. And there are some very depressing pictures out there of locomotives that were recently operable, and I should say recently, as late as the 1980s into the 1990s, and had been restored by ITM, that are just hulks of their former selves. And look worse than you think that something would in a scrapyard, but they are quote-unquote preserved now. And by the way, I don't say that to denigrate whoever put the time and money in to help keep those in existence, but it's just hard to look at that, basic shells when it wasn't that long ago when they were operable and fully capable of doing what locomotives are supposed to do. So that's why we call the Indiana Transportation Museum the Fugly. And what can we take away from that? Well, first of all, what is the biggest problem they faced? It's that they didn't own their own property. No matter what, whether they had a great operation, a precision organization, they didn't own their own property. So all it took was one judge and one mayor to decide, you know what, we want you out. And when that happens, that means you've got to figure out what to do with, again, industrial property, industrial assets that were never meant to be used in this form, although they are, and you've got to figure out where to put them. And that proved to be too much for ITM. Now, they have relocated to Logansport. I don't know the status of the organization, but we do know the museum exists. The track that they were using, part of it was cut back and turned into a trail. And as you know, if you followed me enough, I do not like rails to trails under any circumstances, because usually the rails to trails people are quite obstinate in saying that they can't accept a trail alongside a rail line that would permit both being used. So they seek to prevent any kind of rail service being operated. And so the majority of that line was just cut up, and, it's now a place for fat people to go run, unfortunately. And don't worry, I say that as a fat person myself. And finally, a lack of structure, because one of the things that came out of this was that what led to ITM's condemnation in the first place was the fact that their internal structure, their organization had broken down, and that there was a lot of infighting. Now, of course, all that is anecdotal, but that's the best information that we are able to have now. And if somebody out there has been involved with the Indiana Transportation Museum and wants to shed more of a light on that, and I know it's a difficult thing to rehash, please email me, info@allaboard.media. We'll have you on here as give you a forum to talk about that in a non-confrontational way, because I know you in the audience are more interested in hearing about that than having an argument over it. So now you've seen the good, bad, and the fugly. Now for a little bit of commentary. What really is the most difficult thing I see as in rail preservation is that we, as people who want to be involved in it in some form or another, tend to be far too sharp-elbowed in every way. I see a lot of people who spend a lot of time posting on the internet, and we're glad you do, especially if you do it at the ChatGP50 forums at allthingstrains.com, who will talk a lot about what they want. They will say, I want this, I want that, I want the other, I want it to be painted this way, I want it to be painted that way, and so on. But they really won't make the effort to put something on the table. And I'm never going to be the person that looks at you and says, oh, well, you want this? We'll send a check. I think that's obnoxious behavior. But you should be willing and interested to at least learn what it takes to bring about the things that we want. I've been blessed to go out and see some locomotives under restoration and see the people actually as they are at work to do that. And I got to tell you, it is a lot of work. It's not easy, but I can see from the way the people who are involved in it talk about it, and the fact that they go back time and time again and invest their own money. Guess what? It's damn fulfilling, and that is cool. And frankly, I got some free time. You heard I lost my job. That's something I'm going to get involved in. And I don't care if it ends up tearing up a couple of shirts or giving me a few cuts and bruises. I'm happy to lend a hand, and you should be too. Now, at the same time, we have a lot of people involved in preservation who also get on the internet, and they make it a just cottage industry of saying nasty things to the other people who want to see trains be preserved in a certain way. You say, well, I'd like to see that car painted in Erie, Lackawanna, gray, maroon, and yellow. And there's always somebody who shows up and says, well, you should send a check. Look, if it starts by somebody being obstinate like that, and the first thing you do is you're being nasty to a person, what makes you think they're going to open their wallet and send money to you? What makes you think that they are going to go and volunteer with you if you seem like an absolute grouch? And what makes you think that they're going to get their kids? And yes, I say their kids because the younger people are the ones we need to get more involved into preservation. And I mean people younger than me, the teenagers, the 20-somethings, because they need to learn everything that the folks who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s know, and be able to take that knowledge, improve upon it, and pass it on to the generations following them, so that these things that do get preserved don't end up being just simply stuffed and mounted because nobody has any idea what it is or what to do other than that, hey, it's a train, right? So if you're starting off by being just confrontational and nasty to people, they're not going to come down. They're not going to tell their kids to come down. They're just going to get off the internet or simply whine about what they'd like to see online. You've got to extend a hand, and you've got to be willing to do it in a way that truly is welcoming, because these are people who have the same interests as you, but probably have not been inducted the way that you have. So that is what I have to say about rail preservation, the good, the bad, and the absolute fugly. So thank you so much for joining us on the All Aboard podcast. We will see you later this week, actually on Thursday, for yet another episode this special week. And I hope you have a great day.